สวัสดีค่ะพบกับห่วงใยไทย Business นะคะ Legal in Action เอพิโซด 49/2 นะคะ 49/1 เนี่ยเราได้ฟังซีของ Practitioner นะคะคือคุณสกอตต์ เอเดอร์แมนซึ่งเป็น Chairman ของ Milbank LLP นะคะในเอพิโซด 49/2 ในวันนี้ก็มาฟังอีกท่านหนึ่งชื่อสกอตต์เหมือนกันนะคะ Professor Scott A. Westfahl นะคะซึ่งปัจจุบันก็เป็น Professor of Practice แล้วก็เป็น Director of Executive Education Harvard Law School นะคะซึ่งแน่นอนว่าทั้งตัว Law School เองนะคะก็มีชื่อเสียงแล้วก็โปรแกรมนี้ของที่ Harvard Law School ก็ค่อนข้างเรียกว่า unique นะคะอาจจะถือว่าเป็นผู้นำที่เราไม่ค่อยจะได้เห็นว่า Law Schoolลุกขึ้นมาแล้วก็มีบทบาทแล้วก็เป็นโปรแกรมที่ต้องเรียนว่าได้รับความนิยมนะคะดิฉันเองก็ยังได้เคยมีโอกาสเข้าไปรับมีส่วนร่วมนะคะในโปรแกรมนี้กับ Milbank at Harvard Corporate Council โปรแกรมนะคะเป็นโปรแกรม one week นะคะ1 สัปดาห์แล้วก็ได้ความรู้มากมายนะคะสำหรับ Professor Scott A. Westfahl นะคะนอกจากจะเป็น Director of Executive Education แล้วเนี่ยก็ยังเป็น Faculty Chair Leadership in Law Firms นะคะซึ่งน่าสนใจมากว่าLaw School เนี่ยกลับมาอบรมนะคะให้กับระดับ Executive ด้วยนะคะเพราะว่าเป็นการอบรมในเรื่องของ Leadership เป็นการอบรมให้กับ General Counsel นะคะตำแหน่งแบบเดียวกับที่เรียนทำอยู่เนี่ยมันเป็นไปได้ยังไงนะคะเพราะว่าในความรู้สึกของพวกเราอาจจะรู้สึกว่าจริงๆแล้ว Law School คือคณะนิติศาสตร์เนี่ยก็จะค่อนข้างไปทางวิชาการเพราะฉะนั้นจะมาแนะนำในเรื่องของความเป็นผู้นำนะคะรวมทั้งจริงๆก็มีทั้งส่วนที่เรียกว่าเป็นเรื่องของวิชาการด้วยซ้ำไปนะคะก็จะมีในการเทรนนิ่งก็มีพาร์ทที่ถือว่าเป็นกึ่งวิชาการนะคะเป็น practice นะคะก็มาดูประวัติของ Professor Scott A. Westfahl กันนิดหนึ่งนะคะนอกจากการเป็น faculty chair แล้วก็ดูแลในเรื่องของ executive education แล้วนะคะก็ยังเป็นผู้สอนวิชาเรื่องของ leadership ความเป็นผู้นำ design thinking อันนี้ใครถ้าอยู่ในสายของ startup ก็คงจะคุ้นเคยกับคำนี้นะคะ design thinking and innovation resilience นะคะความยืดหยุ่น problem solving การแก้ปัญหา teams and network in JD curriculum นะคะซึ่งแสดงว่าในวิชาส่วนหนึ่งของหลักสูตรการเรียนกฎหมายของที่ Harvard เนี่ยมีการสอนในเรื่องของทักษะมีการสอนในเรื่องของจะเรียกว่า soft side ก็ได้แต่ว่าก็อาจจะเป็นเชิงของวิธีคิดนะคะรวมทั้งการทำงานเป็นทีมการเน็ตเวิร์กซึ่งเราอาจจะนึกภาพวิชาเหล่านี้ในคณะนิติศาสตร์ของประเทศไทยไม่ออกนะคะว่าหน้าตามันจะเป็นยังไงนะคะนอกจากนั้นเนี่ยก็เป็นคนหนึ่งนะคะที่ lead Harvard Law School ในการที่จะสนับสนุนแล้วก็พัฒนานักกฎหมายในทุกๆสาขาวิชาชีพนะคะแล้วก็ยังเป็น strategic advisor นะคะเป็นที่ปรึกษาในเชิงของ strategy ให้กับ leadership council นะคะอันนี้ก็เน้นในด้านของเรื่องlegal diversity นะคะสำหรับประวัติของ Professor Scott Westfahl นะคะที่คิดว่าในวันนี้ส่วนหนึ่งที่คงสามารถทำให้เขามารันโปรแกรมที่เป็นการเรียกว่าการอบรมผู้บริหารของ law firm หรือว่าของ in-house ของบริษัทต่างๆเนี่ยเพราะว่าก็ background นะคะก็เคยเป็น Director of Professional Development นะคะใน law firm ชื่อ Goodwin Procter นะคะนอกจากนั้นนะคะจริงๆก็เคยทำงานที่บริษัทที่ปรึกษาชั้นนำอย่าง McKinsey นะคะซึ่งแวดวงของที่ปรึกษาทางการเงินก็ดีหรือว่าที่ปรึกษาทั่วไปก็คงจะรู้จักเฟิร์มนี้ดีอยู่แล้วนะคะแล้วก็ยังได้รับการยกย่องยอมรับให้เป็น Innovators of the Year จาก Law Firm Inc. นะคะค่ะก็มาพบกับProfessor Scott Westfahl นะคะซึ่งตัวอย่างของ leadership โปรแกรมนะคะก็ปรากฏในภาพด้านซ้ายนะคะ leadership in corporate counsel leadership in law firm แล้วก็ leading the law firm of the future นะคะซึ่งตรงกับหัวข้อในวันนี้ของเรามากเลยค่ะค่ะก็มาพบกับท่านเลยนะคะ and lawyers for the next decade if we can all predict at all what the next decade will look like seems like there are many new things happening in the world some of which we never thought of seeing and I'll say it's probably a perfect storm so we need to livingly consider what will be next as much as we can so let me start with the first question it has been actually 2 full years or a little bit more after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. How is the legal industry from the law school's perspective?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. That question comes down to metrics and how are you measuring things? So we see record profits at so many large law firms. They've been incredibly busy, incredibly productive. I think, what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing is that they have pivoted really, really brilliantly, surprisingly, in terms of serving clients through remote and hybrid work and through Zoom platforms and very creatively adapting how they work and how they produce. And they've been more productive and super surprised about it because nobody thought 5 years ago that lawyers could work productively from anywhere and collaboratively from anywhere. And thank goodness the technology platforms have evolved just to the point where you can optimize client service pretty readily that way. And so from that metric in terms of amount of client service, quality of client service, it's truly astounding. And from the law firm perspective, what I hear from in-house departments is not a surprise, right? That they've been under tremendous pressure. And it's a varied record. So some industries that were harder hit by COVID had a lot of challenges during the pandemic and, fewer legal staff available, budgets that didn't match what their legal needs were. And they were also getting creative. They moved more into the world of legal ops and optimizing service, looking at AI companies and contract management platforms to optimize and speed service delivery without adding cost. That was really interesting for us to watch. And, I've got my eye on that all the time. But then there's other metrics. The other metrics I look at are the human metrics. And so, I was speaking with a law firm partner a few months ago, and the partner had come from an online partner meeting where they were celebrating the record profits and productivity gains they had had. But the elephant in the room that they weren't talking about was that there was so much more burnout, and they have been experiencing the great resignation with the highest attrition rate from partners and associates that they'd ever experienced. And yet nobody was really talking about it. And we don't have really good metrics to measure that. You can look at attrition rate as a pure metric, but there's also burnout factor, there's disillusionment factor, and there's I think when our business school colleagues are looking at the new world of work and the effects of the pandemic, there's still a lot of things we don't know about its effect on us as human beings. And I think as the legal profession emerges from this, I'm hearing a lot of organizations, both in-house departments and law firms, talking about we have to recover our culture. We've been making withdrawals from the culture bank, and we have to make redeposits now. We have to figure out how to do that. And we have to do it in a world that's not going back to the way it was. This, if we're going to attract the top talent and be a leading legal organization, you cannot imagine that people are going to be back in the offices all the time. It's the way the talent market is going. It's not the way the world is working. I guess it's now about 8 or 9 months ago, I had the opportunity to present about a leadership framework called adaptive leadership. I'll say more about that during our conversation. And it was with CEOs of companies like Zoom and PayPal and eBay, and their whole perspective had been changing. The conversations they were having with their chief talent officers and their human resources department wasn't the debate about work from home or work in an office. It was, let's hire the best talent in the world wherever they happen to be. And yes, that's coming to the legal market. It's going to be really interesting. There's a lot of interesting opportunities coming up with that. There's threats and challenges, but opportunities as well. I just think that what we haven't developed yet is a robust set of metrics to measure how are we doing on a sense of meaning and purpose in the organization, a sense of well-being, our physical and mental health, and our organizational health metrics yet. We don't have a good language for.
Thank you. And how about at law schools? Because when we talk about like law firms or at corporate, we do work from home, we do vacation by the beach or up in the mountain. But what about law schools?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, our experience at Harvard Law School and what I know from faculty at other schools who I'm close with is that, you know, we all agree that teaching on Zoom was very hard. And the experiences of our students that are often most shaped by the residential campus experience, at least in the US educational system, that's a very important part of your community and the relationships that you form, especially in the LLM programs where you have students come to Harvard who are already practicing attorneys in various countries, and they come and they're at Harvard for a year. The network they form worldwide is really, really important. And it's harder to make those personal connections. I think we achieved some success through the Zoom platform and online teaching, but there's no doubt that we've come back to campus now, and the energy in the classroom, the energy in front of us is fantastic. The other good news, though, is that, you know, when you shake a system up, when you take people who've always traditionally done things the same way, and they have no choice but to adapt, they start to adapt. So very quickly, when Harvard Law School was one of the first schools, if not the first major school, to announce we're online totally. So March 2020, we shut down before spring break and everything was online. We finished that semester, but during the summer before the next year started, which was also all online, the 2020-21 academic year was all online, we brought in experts who were training us how to teach better online, and the school provided us technology. There were fun faculty workshops where for the first time in a very long time, faculty members were sharing with each other how to teach and ideas and technology and interesting approaches. And there was a lot of great community building that way. And there were a lot of professors who had, you know, taught in a very traditional way, who were trying new things. Let's have breakout groups for this. Let's have polls for this. Let's have guest speakers who come in. What's really nice about the Zoom and the online platform is, you know, and by the way, I want to invite you to be a guest in one of my classes someday, because it's really easy for you to just Zoom in for 20 minutes. You don't have to travel to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and back and spend 3 or 4 days of travel to get here. And so in my classes, I had, you know, interesting guests from all over the world, Zooming for 20 minutes in a very interactive way. And we found ways to do things creatively. We found ways to build some community. All of that, now that we're back on campus, you know, we're trying to retain some of those learnings. Our slides are better. Our use of technology is better. We're using breakout groups, and we're using teams. I think it's been a good movement. I hope we don't lose that momentum. My next hope for the legal profession and for the law schools is that we realize that because of these platforms that let us project globally, we can now collaborate more across law schools and across other types of schools in an interdisciplinary way. If we're teaching students, for example, about climate change, we ought involving people from all over the world from different disciplines. And we can have a course, we can have classes, we can have forums that are much more inclusive that way, of other voices, important, diverse voices that help us solve the problem that we're addressing. And I think that's very exciting to me. I think we're all still coming through and recovering our own mental health. So we haven't yet moved into some of those areas as much as I would like. But I think that the younger generation, especially of law professors, is going to have this muscle memory now. We're the next decade some tremendous advances forward in global legal education.
I think in fact you answer the question I was about to ask, and I'm sure that law professors would love to hear as well, because we all know how fascinating the Socratic method has been always like the symbol of law schools in the US. So that we were all like wondering how people, especially law professors, handle that in the class, online, and especially the executive education program.
Yeah, with Harvard Law School executive education, you know, it was funny. You know, we obviously suffered by not being able to bring people from around the world in person on our campus. Our programs are so exciting when we have, you know, 50 or 60 general counsel from 20 different countries coming for, you know, a 4.5-day program. The buzz in the room is amazing and electric, and the relationships that form. But we were able to pivot and do those online in really interesting ways. And people who would never have had the time to travel all the way to Harvard were able to do this. And I was very impressed that there were general counsel in Australia and Thailand and Singapore who were staying up late and still participating. And people in California getting up really early and participating. And we had a global community in those programs. You know, we adjusted schedules. We weren't able to involve as much content, but the lessons that we learned is that, you know, going forward, we're going to be able to continue to have hybrid content. So people will come now. For this week, we're running our first in-person program with Milbank, with 47 law firm Milbank 5th year. So the first program we've had in 2 years on our classroom. What we're also thinking, though, is now that we've learned how to teach well online, when we have a program, you know, and general counsel come to us from all these countries, and they're there in our classroom for 4.5 days, and they go back, you know, 3, 4, 6 months later, we can convene them online and have another session and reconnect them in ways that it was always really hard for us to figure out, how do we keep the community alive? Because what happens in our executive education classroom is people are learning as much from each other as they learn from us, and they're sharing perspectives and how they're addressing new types of problems. We can create that community now and keep it living in an online form because we built the trust in the classroom, the relationships in the classroom, and I'm so excited about that. Including with law students too, who are coming through our law school programs, our LLM programs. You know, the ability for us then to convene groups and continue learning across the arc of a lawyer's career is exponential now. I you know, 5 years ago, you never could have convinced me that we could do this effectively online. I actually really enjoy online teaching. It gives me flexibility as to where I'm living from and teaching. You know, I moved down to Key West, Florida last year for 7 months, and I was teaching from the beach, you know, and it was lovely. So I don't mind, you know, filling up my schedule with more online teaching as long as I can be also having my time you know, to relax and you know, refresh myself. But I can blend in a 2-hour session with alumni or a new type of group that I'm teaching, and it extends my ability to connect with audiences and people around the world throughout my whole calendar year in ways that never were possible before. And I love it. I really do.
So I guess your students don't have an excuse that they are not dressing properly, things like that, right? So,
exactly.
Even without like an eye contact in the classroom, they still need to actively participate.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, what was hard about the Zoom is that when students go through an entire day of Zoom, you experience fatigue. It's really hard to do. So in our executive education programs, we pace ourselves. We spread the program out, and we have only a couple of sessions. There's breaks, and we're making sure that the programs are highly interactive. It's not a lecture-based, you know, event. It's very interactive, lots of activities, and a lot of small group discussions. When I love the breakout features on Zoom and online platforms, you get that intimate discussion, and it's really nice. Actually, they work better than in the classroom. In the physical classroom, it's very hard for me to create. If I have a day-long session and everybody's sitting in the same place, I can say, okay, turn to 3 or 4 people next to you and talk, but then they're talking to the same people all day. And what's also funny is that when lawyers start talking, they don't want to stop talking. And so I have to say, please come back together. Let's go, in the classroom to bring them back. So we're all at attention. On Zoom, I push a button and the breakout groups end and they're back with me and they have no choice. And I was able to mix up the groups a lot. Let's have groups of 2s now. Let's have groups of 6. Let's have different people meeting different people. And we were very deliberate about that. And what people were surprised about in our online programs, and we're going to continue some online programs. We have a terrific innovation program about driving innovation for both in-house people and law firm leaders that we're continuing to run online. We just ran it last month, and they're really surprised at the end of the program how many people they've gotten to know and that they actually feel really close to each other. They've traded ideas in these breakout groups, and they've shared, it's not quite the same as going to cocktails and dinner, and there's a deeper personal sharing that happens in the in-person program, but you can accomplish, 85% of that relationship building really well online and more broadly, because when you have cocktails and dinner, people opt to talk to the same people, and there's a social dynamic, and they'll sit with same people at dinner. And online, I'm really deliberately mixing up the groups, and I like that. The broader question about what does legal education look like in the classroom, I think is interesting too. I mentioned that the Socratic method in the US with the large classroom and the professor, relatively aggressively questioning students, very participatory. I think what we're noticing too is that they are starting to use polls and breakouts, and I really appreciate that. One of the things too that I want us to pivot to a lot more to is working in teams. All of the classes I teach for my law students are team-based, and the reason why is I think that well, there's a number of reasons, but the main ones are that lawyers don't actually learn how to work in a team, and then they go out into the legal world and they don't know what a team is. If you look at every other profession, the way teams work is very different. I spent 10 years as a practicing lawyer and then went to McKinsey for 6 years, and they work in real teams. The team has a launch meeting at the beginning of the project where the leaders of the team talk about who is the client, why is this work important, why are we doing this, what's the history of our relationship with the client, who are the client individuals, where are they in their careers, how do we make them look good. Everybody on the team contributes something about their background, their interest in the project, their Myers-Briggs personality type. They figure out how they're going to work together, and then they start the project. In 10 years of legal practice, I never had a team launch meeting. And there's a lot of really good academic research about teams that says highly predictive of team performance is whether you have a kickoff meeting that sets all those parameters and expectations, right? So I think the pivot towards new ways of teaching that we've experienced in the last 2 years gives us a platform, and some more confidence to try some new things. And so I'm already helping some faculty members of ours who are starting to work with their students in teams in different ways, which I really appreciate. So we're teaching them how to launch the teams. How do the teams give feedback to each other? How do the teams reflect at the end of a project about what went well, what didn't, what did they learn? And again, in every other profession you look at, that's what teams do. But our legal teams, very, very rarely, a project is over, does the team get together and say, everybody on the team is going to say one thing that we did well, one thing we should look at. I've never experienced that as a lawyer, and there aren't that many lawyers who do this.
Right. Yeah.
What I know about every military team is they'll come back from a day in the field with the platoon, and they come back and the lieutenant says to every soldier, she'll say, what went well, what didn't? And every soldier has to say something. And as the leader, she guides the discussion, and she doesn't speak first, she speaks last. And there's a good look. It takes 15 or 20 minutes. It doesn't take much time. But lawyers think, where can I build this? They don't know what to do. And that's ridiculous. It's worth it because you save so much, you gain so much more in efficiency. And research about teams will show that what's highly predictive of team performance is this idea of psychological safety. Does every team member feel like their voice should be heard? And when you go through an exercise like that, everyone says something that went well, something that didn't. They all feel valued, even the most junior member, and their engagement is higher. The one thing that we've experienced that's really terrible in the workforce, of course, the last 2 years is this: everybody was questioning the meaning of what they do, and the great resignation that academics are talking about was driven mostly by the idea that I don't know why I'm doing this. And, you know, critical moments like a pandemic move us toward thinking about what really matters in life. And I think people ought to be working in jobs that mean something to them. I tell my students, your goal is to find a job that doesn't feel like work, that feels like it's meant to be doing it. And I think in the legal profession, we're terrible at talking about meaning and purpose. I can say more about that as we go forward, but you know, I'd love your thoughts and your reactions too. Are you seeing this too? You know,
right. That's very interesting. In fact, I mean to ask you, because when I read your CV or what they said about you, is that you also teach courses on leadership, design thinking, innovation, resilience, problem solving, teams and network in the JD program, which is did you say that is this new, or it has
I've been doing this? Yeah, I've been a professor for about 8 years, and my classes have evolved, but I started out teaching around those subjects. That's where I'm most passionate about, and where I think we have a large gap.
Right.
You know, in our profession, we've never had a tradition of leadership development, teaching people about leadership across the arc of years. But if you look at consulting firms, the big four, military, other professions, every couple of years, if you're in one of those organizations, they take you offline for significant leadership training to prepare you for your next level of responsibility with a group of cohort peers. McKinsey does this every year and a half, 2 years. You're offline for another training. My dad was a nuclear submarine captain in the United States Navy throughout his career. Every time he was going to get promoted, they took him offline for significant training to prepare him for his next role. And we haven't done that in our profession. So starting to teach about that is really important.
Right. Oh, that's I think that's very interesting, because when the pandemic started, people talk a lot about leadership and what are like the skills that we do require, and one of those is coordination. So it's all like soft skill, and I do agree that law schools in the past don't ever mention this kind of thing. So so leading that to my next question that I would love to hear from you. What do you see the difference between the law schools in the past, maybe past decade, and how it looks like for the next decade?
Well, I think that, there's a lot of good that comes out of a crisis like the pandemic. There's a famous quote, a saying, never waste a good crisis. And this idea that we had to rethink a lot of things means that we now are more adaptive in our approach to challenging the way we've always done things. So that gives me hope. What we're also seeing from the profession, that there are more opportunities now for the legal profession and professionals who are out practicing to share their experiences back with law schools and from which law schools can learn. So at Harvard, I know that our dean has been organizing focus groups of alumni and prominent lawyers and people from different disciplines, and having them just talk to us about what is it do you think the lawyers of the future need, and what should we be remembering to teach or learning how to teach. And I think that's really critical. Back in 2017, Professor David Wilkins at Harvard and I co-authored an article in the Stanford Law Review about lawyer development. And what we described was a framework that we believe lawyer development is a component of three things. One is teaching about legal technical skills and knowledge. And I think that, law firms and law schools have taught people how to think like a lawyer and focus on those technical aspects of law very well for a long, long time. But the other two components where we underinvest both, at law school, but also outside in the profession in legal departments and law firms is a set of leadership and professional skills, like working in teams, negotiations, managing conflict, having difficult conversations, business related skills. As I don't call them soft skills, so I call them all professional skills. Skills that any professional in any profession needs to have, especially as they get more senior as leaders. The third is networks, and it's an interesting thing. This comes from observations that I had and then further research. But when I left the law and went to McKinsey, a global management consulting firm, it was the first time I started interacting with students who had gotten their MBAs rather than their law degrees. And the MBAs from Harvard, Wharton, Stanford, our top U.S. business schools, or IE, or Said, people from global law schools outside the U.S. This was before LinkedIn and before Facebook, Meta. They knew where all their classmates were. They had gone to business school and they worked in teams in business school, and they built these relationships that will endure the rest of their lives. And they help personally, professionally. Those networks are so powerful. In law schools, and this is true outside the US, inside the US, people come away with one or two friends they keep in touch with, because of the way we teach. In the classic European model, it's the huge lecture hall with 300 people and a dispersed educational experience where there's no teams and they don't get to know each other. In the US model, it's the highly Socratic individual learning model, and it's competitive in the classroom. And so while they're collegial with each other, they don't form relationships that endure beyond the educational experience. And so what I'm really proud of is when I teach about teams, I teach a class that it's a team-based, my innovation and design thinking class, for example. I form them into teams, and they have to do a team launch where they really get to know each other. And then they're involved in this very intense process. The way the class works is I teach them about design principles with my co-instructor. His name is Dan Yee. He's now head of strategy for the Access to Justice Office at the U.S. Department of Justice. So he's a Justice Department lawyer, but he's design thinking trained. We teach this class together, and it's so much fun. We teach them about design principles. They're forming as a team, and each of the teams has an actual client, like the Justice Department. And at the end, they have to give a presentation. The Justice Department might pose, here's a design challenge where we have an office that actually helps immigrants who are being discriminated against in the workplace, for example, but nobody knows about it. So the design challenge is, how can we more effectively reach the community that we're trying to help and get the word out? And my students gave a brilliant presentation to the Justice Department. They adopted many of their recommendations, and the team, they're going to be friends forever. And I just know this because now I talk to students who had my courses many years ago, and I'll say, are you still in touch with your teammates? And they say yes. And I think that's really powerful. What we also know about problem solving is that diverse teams solve problems more effectively, and networks solve problems more effectively. If we create an environment in the legal profession, at law school first, and then within legal organizations where people are forming these relationships, they'll do much better. In the legal profession, outside of law schools, for example, the way networks operate, versus where we see in other things, the consulting firms, the big four, have enormous alumni networks, and they're highly engaged with the alumni of their organizations, and they keep in touch, and they re-recruit people back to the firm. And it's, McKinsey's alumni network is very powerful. Most law firms never even thought about creating an alumni department, and I'm sure law departments don't either. We have got this in our heads that the network is so important. So those are components where I think that we could do much better teaching about to solve global problems more effectively. We need that network.
You reminded me of one talk that we had on Clubhouse. So basically, lawyers came. Junior lawyers came and asked a question and raised the topic, and then we finally organized that. So their issue was that what they were facing in law firms in their daily life. Nothing was ever been taught in law school, and then we kept on talking on what's about those topics or issues. They said like business development, how to run and manage law firm.
Yes.
And in fact, how to lead and the corporation things. Do you think this is because of the way law school has? I mean, the way we all were trained at law school. That because professor made us work so hard that we don't have time to party or
that's partly true also, is that there's too much we overload the curriculum sometimes, especially in our first year. We have a very it's too much work. And I think that's hard. I think that for example, our case method is a very powerful way of teaching, but I question whether it needs to be the only way that we're teaching doctrinal law in our paradigm. That's typically what happens, and it overloads on the reading of cases that happened in the past. We experimented for several years here with a problem-solving workshop method that was different. In addition to learning doctrinal law by reading judicial opinions that were issued, we had problem-solving cases that were more like business school cases, and some of our faculty continue to use cases like this. And what a case like that looks like is, here's the situation. You are the lawyer in the middle of the problem as it's happening. You're not reading the judicial opinion about a case that went through all the processes, went into conflict, was resolved by a court and an appellate court, and here's the opinion. You're in the middle of the situation as it's happening. What will you do? And we had doing exercises and thinking about what is the role of lawyering in this situation? Who is the client? How do you represent them? At the end of those, we would spend two days or so, 2 class periods working through a case like that, and then I would invite in a lawyer who was actually practicing in that area, and they would say, here's how I would have handled this, and they do a question and answer, and the students learned so much from that because of the context was so rich. And I think there's new ways we can explore how to do that would deepen the learning and that intersection of here's the doctrine, but here's how it actually works in the field and in practice. I think that intersection, I think we're not very good yet at doing.
Right. And because the Harvard Law School's executive education, I would say, is quite unique. It has been very successful. So let me ask you, how was it started? Because I mean, usually when we work in law firms, we would think that each firm has its own way to train people. Never thought of like going back to law school and get law professors, business school professors to lead us to think.
Yeah, and it was never clear within, as law firms were saying we can train each other, of course, they were only training each other on substantive legal matters. And the legal profession's idea of continuing legal education was only about learning deepening your substantive legal topical expertise. It wasn't about leadership, management, and more holistic problem solving. So the origins of this, as I've been able to determine, is that maybe it's about 25 years ago or so, Harvard Business School started studying professional services firms for the first time. Traditionally, they had studied leadership in large corporate organizations because that was the dominant business paradigm where their students and graduates and executive participants were active, the large company like IBM, what they realized is their students weren't going to those companies anymore. Most of them were going to management consulting firms like McKinsey, Bain, BCG, all sorts of other, boutique consulting firms or the big four. And they were going to professional firms, partnerships. And our business school had never studied leadership in that context. So they started going out in the field and researching what does leadership look like and developing a set of cases and materials and theories about that. what then happened is they developed an executive education program focused on leadership and professional services firms. And some lawyers started to go to those programs. Law firm chairman, managing partners started to attend those programs. And then about 2007, a unique set of events happened. Professor Ashish Nanda, who was one of the professors at Harvard Business School teaching about professional services firms, got to know Professor David Wilkins at Harvard Law School. Professor Wilkins is the leading scholar in the world of the legal profession itself. And I would put money on the fact many of you probably listening have already met David Wilkins somehow, because he's that prominent. And I think there's no lawyer in the world who has more contacts around the world than David. He's the best connected lawyer in the world, I believe. So he's studying the global legal profession. He starts to work with Professor Nanda, and they're talking about how can we bring this concept of leadership and professional services more generally to the legal profession, which in some ways is similar, but there are differences. And so Professor Nanda joined Harvard Law School from Harvard Business School. Professor Wilkins and Professor John Coates, also who teaches at Harvard Business School and Harvard Law School, combined start launching our program on leadership in law firms was the first program, then leadership in corporate counsel. From those early days in 2007, 2008, we then started writing our own cases and studying combining our research on the legal profession through Professor Wilkins. He has his research center is called the Harvard Law School Center on the Legal Profession. It produces incredible scholarship about how the legal profession is changing around the world. They have studied deeply the legal market in China, in Brazil, in India. Now they're studying Africa, I believe, is their next research project. They're studying how technology is transforming practice, especially in-house. All of these different research projects and global demographics and diversity within law firms. That research combined with the business schools principles around leadership and professional services firms all came together. And now we've been moving forward with our programs, also partnering with our Kennedy School of Government to bring some of their really important leadership paradigms to bring them forward. Our newest program is about leading change for lawyers. And one of the most important leadership change frameworks ever developed is called adaptive leadership, and it was developed by Professor Ron Heifetz and his colleagues at the Kennedy School of Government. This semester, I'm teaching the first ever class for Harvard Law student JDs and LLMs on adaptive leadership with a faculty member, Farai Chipungu, from the Kennedy School, and she is now the program chair of our program Leading Change for Lawyers, and we're bringing this adaptive leadership approach over. So we've grown. We are now having programs for younger law firm partners and in-house. We have a program for women lawyers, both in-house and within law firms and government. We have a program on innovation in the law, master classes on innovation, master classes on leading change, and collaboration. And we've been able to kind of continue to grow to meet the emerging needs of the profession, I think, and it's been really exciting. There is a movement too across, at least in U.S. law schools, where there are a number of law schools now starting to include leadership within their JD curriculum. There's nothing like our executive program anywhere else at any other law school, and I think we have a particular advantage because Harvard is seen as a global convener. So when we have our leadership in corporate counsel program or our leadership in law firms program, as I mentioned before, people come from all over the world, and there's a very special learning environment that I think Harvard's reach is just able to attract differently than other schools.
Right. That's really impressive, and even more impressive that law school does not stop thinking. And myself,
you have to keep advancing. Yes.
I myself had a chance to meet David twice and Professor Nanda once. Do you agree? Both of them are, super charming and very
incredible
teachers. Yeah, incredible. So because you mentioned about joining with Kennedy School, lead me to think that the world is getting more and more complicated with with a lot of issues, including geopolitics, inequality, ESGs, and other stuff. How you see law schools' role in those areas?
Yeah, and again, I think this is one of the most critical reasons why we need to continue to adapt what and how we're teaching. The problems, the global problems that we're facing are interdisciplinary, very complex problems. And lawyers, I believe, are uniquely positioned to add value to problem solving on these important issues for a number of reasons. One, of course, the technical legal expertise. You can't solve climate change without law and regulation and an understanding of how that affects business and society, and legal education frames that in a very powerful way, traditional legal education. The other things, though, that I think that give lawyers an advantage is that we're able to step back and be facilitators. I think one of the things that is really important about the role lawyers play in systems is that we're not often the forefront, the principal. We're more often the agent. We're listening, we're bringing people together. Deal lawyers are making deals. They know how to help people negotiate, find common ground, find solutions, and we can be very creative that way. There's so much value we can add to that. What we need to do is enhance lawyers' skills in facilitation, communication, teamwork, resolving conflict, working across differences. The Harvard program on negotiation is the leading program in the world on teaching negotiation and some of these techniques, and our students are all taking those classes. That gives me great hope that we're preparing them to make a difference in the world that way. The reason I'm trying to bring adaptive leadership to the law school is that I think it's a particularly timely model for addressing problems in uncertain times. And here are some basic principles in the model. And again, we're teaching a major master class on this. We're incorporating this content now into our Leadership and Corporate Counsel program. We're incorporating it into our Leadership and Law Firms program. First principle is leadership is an activity, not a role. You don't have to be named the leader to have impact as a leader in a system. And from anywhere in the system, you can start to try to create change. The second key principle is that there's formal authority, which means I have a title and I can have some control over a system because of the authority that people have entrusted me with. But then more importantly, there's informal authority, my reputation for putting the organization or the system first, my goodwill, my relationships and my network, my ability to resolve conflict, my ability to be generous in a network and be helpful to people. I build up all of this informal authority, so even though I don't have a formal title, I can still have more impact. The third principle is the difference between a technical challenge and an adaptive challenge. A technical challenge is a challenge where the organization has a problem, the system has a problem, and there's knowledge and expertise that exists about how to solve that problem. You just have to put time, money, resources into it, hire a consultant, bring someone in and get this problem done. It's a project management exercise, right? As an example, I mentioned before that we had to learn at the beginning of the pandemic how to teach on Zoom. Law firms had to, and legal departments had to learn, how do I serve my clients on a Zoom platform? There was technical knowledge about that. And you hired experts who got you on the platform, taught you how it worked, and shared some best practices about online teaching. And that was very helpful. Now, as we emerge from the pandemic, there's the question in organizations I mentioned before, what does the new world of work look like? Is it from home or for hybrid? And there's no technical answer to that. This is an adaptive challenge where they talk about it at the Kennedy School as if we're a biological organism. The climate changes and the biological organism has to shed DNA that is no longer adaptive, retain core DNA, and then move forward to develop new DNA that meets the new climate. And so leadership, then fourth principle, is about creating a holding environment where you can ask questions and have difficult conversations and talk about the trade-offs, slowly move people through change. You're shedding deeply held values, beliefs, ways of working that aren't adaptive anymore, and you're bringing them through that change. The way you do that, fifth principle, is getting on the balcony, looking at the whole system. Who are all the stakeholders in this system? Where are their deeply held values and beliefs? What are we asking them to change? And most importantly, what are they afraid of losing? Where are the losses? People are much more afraid of loss than change. We go through change all the time, and we're not actually afraid of change. With people start families, that's a huge change in their lives, but they're happy about it and they celebrate it. What we're afraid of is when a system is changing around us and we have to give up things that the way we've always done it. And I have to start moving through change. So leadership, sixth principle, is the art of disappointing people at a pace they can handle and bringing them through that change. So when we look at the things, the challenges, global warming, human rights, diversity, equity, and inclusion, ESG, these are adaptive challenges, and at a macro level, but then there are micro challenges within each of those that are adaptive. You're asking systems and people to give up some deeply held values, principles, retain their core principles, and move forward. As one example, a very simple, simplified example, you're in a law firm and there are senior partners who are very traditional, who say, look, the only way a lawyer can learn is the way I learned, which was be in the office all the time. Mm-hmm. And, if we're going to be the best law firm, they've got to all come back all the time. Now, we know the climate has changed. And for the large law firm to hire the best talent and to say you have to be in the office all the time and there's no remote flexibility, you will not attract the best talent anymore. Mm-hmm. So if I'm having that conversation with that senior partner, I'm saying, look, at our core DNA, we believe we're one of the best law firms in the world, and we will always want to have the best, most talented lawyers. And we are very committed to their learning and development, and we're going to develop the next generation of super lawyers like you. What we also know, though, is to develop, and those lawyers is going to have to be done differently because we won't attract the best lawyers anymore in this new climate. So we're going to retain the core DNA of top talent, commitment to learning and development. We're just going to do it a little differently. And here are some things we're going to try. We're going to pilot. And you walk them through change. So not everything changes at once. You're piloting, you're moving along, you're learning, you're growing. You have to adapt a different mentality about experimentation. This is really hard. So I mentioned, I teach about innovation and design thinking for lawyers. I run workshops in our executive programs on design thinking. I consult with a lot of law firms and legal departments on design thinking workshops. And a real challenge is we taught you in law school and as lawyers it has to be perfect the very first time. And let me tell you, that's not the way innovation works. And designers will pilot something, you get a rough prototype, you then put it in front of the client or the customer, you test it, you see what's wrong with it, you observe, you go back and you try again and you keep improving. And that's not in our DNA. So as we move through this change and the way the profession now has to adapt a lot more rapidly and better than we've ever done, we have to be more open to that change. My hope is that in the pandemic, things were shaken up so much and everybody had to adapt because there was no choice. We built some muscles, right? We've got some more strength now that we can start to exercise in new ways. Let's try this. We were successful in serving clients during the pandemic. We can also try a different approach to diversity and equity inclusion in the firm. We can try a different business model over here. And this is, I know I'm going on a long time about this, but I think these are really critical principles that lawyers' skills at getting on the balcony and taking perspective, listening. We have some tremendous core skills that make us particularly good at the application of this model of leadership if we can internalize it.
Yes, in order for law schools and also like law firms to train lawyers to be problem solver rather than troublemakers or people who add more problems to the issues. I think you sort of mentioned and described which is so valuable. But if you would put it like in a brief, in a nutshell, what skills or attributes you think that as tips for the next gen lawyer
right.
or
Yeah,
for
exactly.
lawyers in the next decade?
I've mentioned some of them before, how teams actually work with launches and team reflection after project reflection, communication, how networks operate and how you leverage networks and build networks. I don't say networking ever because as an introvert or as a person who types as an introvert, networking is a scary thing and it feels very artificial. Network building and network science there's an academic field in network science that's very different and accessible to everybody. You don't have to be the life of the party or the big presence on the stage to have a network and to build a network authentically. We're having this conversation because you're in my network. And then we met at a program. The next set of skills, I started to allude to it in my discussion about adaptive leadership, is how do you innovate and brainstorm effectively? How do you generate new kinds of ideas and thinking? And what's critical about this and the muscle memory I'm trying to build in my classes about this is traditional legal education was built to prepare lawyers for a particular kind of role. And that particular kind of role is to be highly paid and highly selected to be able to be critical thinkers. So what's wrong with this system is something that lawyers are really good. What's wrong with this idea? An idea appears and we can shoot it down from every possible angle and imagine what will go wrong. It's a pessimistic kind of orientation, but it's also very helpful. When I was a deal lawyer practicing law, if I did not anticipate all of the ways this deal could fall apart and build in protections in the documents for my client, I was not doing my job. If I'm a litigator, I have to imagine all the possible ways the case could go wrong or who's lying about this and where are the holes. I've got to be a very critical thinker. Those are super important skills to the practice of law. But when you're also talking about creative problem solving, if you bring that approach to the table, you're not going to get anywhere. So what I'm training students to do now in this idea of brainstorming and facilitation, and if you're talking about global problems, a lawyer as facilitator, it's a different role. What typically happens, and I see this all the time, is there'll be a group of lawyers and they're supposed to come up with a new idea. And so, Mary throws up an idea and the whole group shoots it down as brutally as possible. And then John has an idea, but he's hesitant to raise it. When he does raise it, it's a lot less creative than Mary's because he saw what happened to Mary's idea. It got shot down. And the team has an hour to do this, and they spend, 55 minutes on Mary's idea, brutally attacking it, and about 5 minutes on John's idea, and they walk out with nothing new. What designers do is something very different. So I work with Rochelle Adranli, for example, who's general counsel at IDEO and chief legal officer and has other roles there now. When we have a meeting with Rochelle and her team, she will throw out Post-its around the room. And she'll say, okay, the question on the table is X. And it's a hard question. Everybody, without talking, write down your 3 most creative best ideas on some Post-its. And we all do that individually. And then she says, okay, Scott, you stand up, put those Post-its up on the wall, tell us about your ideas. And there's no critique or judgment coming from the group. I talk about my ideas, and then the next person stands up, and the next person. And we have all broadly shared our ideas. And then we step back as a group and we say, wait a minute, Scott's idea relates to Mary's idea and also John's, and let's group these and let's think, well, that idea is probably not going to work. But then they start to narrow towards a solution set, but it's based on a much broader, more inclusive set of data. So this is where diversity, equity, inclusion matter. A diverse team outperforms our homogenous team, but only if you surface all the diverse opinions. And we haven't been trained as lawyers how to do that. So for next generation lawyers, you have to start understanding the ability to pilot, experiment, and learn, the ability to brainstorm, flex, and adapt. With adaptive leadership, the idea of looking up, not trying to impose the technical system, which in that law firm would have been, okay, we're going to do 4 days a week in the office and 1 at home. Like, that's a technical solution, but did we answer the problem? Did we solve for what we need to solve? They don't even know. And they announce it as the policy, not an experiment, right? In the system, how are you gathering data? How are you listening? How are you observing, accounting for all stakeholders, and moving people through change? How do you have courageous conversations? You're in a meeting and you know there's an issue that no one wants to talk about. This is what I'm training my students in our adaptive leadership. Professor Chifungo and I are forcing our class. There's an issue on the table that no one's talking about. And we'll just throw out, how come no one is talking about this? And we call this a leadership lab exercise. This is developed from Ron Heifetz and his curriculum at the Kennedy School. It's very intimidating. The students are just said, we tell them it's leadership lab time, and it's your time. Teach each other. And what aren't you talking about? And we'll throw out observations once in a while, and they need to do the hard work of asking questions about it. We had a government official come into class 2 weeks ago who's in the middle of an adaptive challenge. He's trying to bring a team through change that has worked very traditionally. And he described what's happening right now in that system is that everybody's kind of doing their own thing because no one wants to have the hard conversation about needing a collective strategy and approach. It's too hard. So no one's talking about it. He said, I had a meeting with the team and I wasn't courageous enough to raise that as a point of discussion. And so what we're trying to teach them, and what I think lawyers of the future need to do, is just have these skills of what they say in the adaptive framework is you're raising the temperature in the room. The water in the pot is starting to move around, but you're not letting it boil over into chaos. You've got to have those hard conversations and you have to confront them. Lawyers, I think, typically, especially in law firms, are passive aggressive. And we let issues fester. There's a lot of elephants walking around that no one wants to talk about. They're making good money, so they're just going to let it happen. And it's unfortunate to me. Diversity, equity, inclusion is one of those big issues. They might try to impose once in a while a technical solution. We're going to have a mentoring program, and here's how we're going to structure it. And then they find out it really didn't make a difference. Why? Because they weren't, as an adaptive leaders, looking at what's really wrong with the system. I've gone on a long time, but I hope that's a helpful start too.
Yes, obviously. We come to an end of the program, so just want to hear like your final words for the audience who are law school professors to encourage them.
I think it's important as a global community. The legal profession has never been more needed to make progress on the increasingly challenging multidisciplinary problems, and that we are uniquely positioned to make a difference. If we can take the momentum we gained from the pandemic to learn about new ways, new approaches, to collaborate, to pilot, to experiment, to open up our thinking, we can prepare the next generation of lawyers to address these problems in a way that will truly save the world. And the moment could not be more critical for that. And I think the more we're able to have these kinds of dialogues, and even the fact that we can do this now on a Zoom platform that's going to be global, is so much more powerful. Let's remember these tools that we've started to develop. Let's build their utility. Let's find new tools and be committed to this mission together of actively experimenting, actively connecting, building our network, leveraging our network for this kind of change. And with our Harvard Law School Executive Education Program, we exist for that reason. We're not about making money. We're mission driven. We want to help lawyers across their arc of their careers to connect, to learn about leadership, to come together to drive change. And I really hope that we continue to find active partners and participants from all over the globe who want to join us in that experiment. And I invite all of you to consider coming to our programs and thinking about us that way, because I think we have a lot to offer, and we want to plant those seeds all over the world.
Many thanks for the very encouraging final words. And in fact, that inspired me to register one of
Yes,
one of
please.
the executive programs at
We'd love to see
Harvard.
you again. Exactly.
Many thanks, Professor Scott, and
Thank
I'm
you.
sure that the audience will find to be very useful, hearing all the tips and all the useful thoughts. And I'm sure that people will get the answer of what's the next decade look like for them. Thanks again.
You're welcome. And,
Thanks very much. ค่ะเอพิโซด 49/2 เดินทางมาถึงช่วงท้ายแล้วนะคะ เชื่อว่าท่านผู้ชมคงจะได้แง่คิดข้อคิดดีๆรวมทั้งสิ่งที่อาจจะนำมาพัฒนาปรับปรุงการเรียนการสอนในประเทศไทยมีวิชาหลายวิชาที่เขาสอนกันในระดับ JD นะคะที่มันคล้ายๆ soft side หรือว่ามันเป็นด้านของ mindset นะคะน่าสนใจมากๆ Professor Scott Westfahl เนี่ยก็ยังได้เล่าให้เราฟังถึงบทความนะคะซึ่งดิฉันเองก็คิดว่าอยากจะแนะนำไม่ว่าจะเป็นlaw school หรือว่า law firm เองที่น่าไปอ่านมากนะคะชื่อบทความคือ The Leadership Imperative Collaborative Approach to Professional Development in the Global Age of More for Less นะคะซึ่งเป็นการเขียนร่วมกันของ Professor Scott แล้วก็ Professor David Wilkins ซึ่งก็มีชื่อเสียงมากๆเช่นเดียวกันในแวดวงของการบริหารงาน law firm หรือว่าlawyer ในยุคใหม่ๆนะคะที่น่าสนใจกว่านั้นนะคะทั้งสองท่านเป็น professor ที่ Harvard Law School นะคะแต่ว่าบทความนี้ซึ่งเขียนในปี 2017 และยังทันสมัยอยู่เนี่ยเป็นบทความที่ลง Stanford Law Review เราก็จะได้เห็นนะคะว่าขนาด Law School ที่ก็ต้องถือว่าในมุมของการแข่งขันก็คงมีนะคะทั้งคู่ก็เป็น Top 5 Law School ของอเมริกาแต่ในมุมของความร่วมมือเนี่ยก็น่าสนใจมากๆนะคะมีหลายเรื่องที่เขาเองก็ไม่ได้หยุดการพัฒนาเพราะฉะนั้น Law School ในประเทศไทยก็อาจจะต้องมาทบทวนตั้งแต่เรื่องของการปฏิรูปวิชานิติศาสตร์นะคะรวมทั้ง Law School จะมีบทบาทในการสร้างคนออกไปเป็น lawyer ได้ยังไงจะทำยังไงให้นักกฎหมายเนี่ยมีเรียกว่ามีlegal mind นะคะซึ่งก็อาจจะสามารถช่วยพัฒนาแล้วก็แก้ไขปัญหาของประเทศเราในอนาคตคงจะไม่เห็นผลภายในข้ามวันข้ามคืนนะคะกรุงโรมก็ไม่ได้สร้างเสร็จในวันเดียวเพราะฉะนั้นเราก็เดี๋ยวจะมาฟังกันต่อนะคะในเอพิโซด 50ซึ่งก็จะแบ่งออกเป็น2ช่วงเช่นเดียวกันเราคุยกับlaw firm ชั้นนำเราคุยกับ law school ชั้นนำของอเมริกาแล้วเดี๋ยวกลับมาคุยกับประเทศไทยนะคะแขกรับเชิญก็ต้องพิเศษแน่ๆนะคะก็ต้องบอกว่า stay tuned นะคะติดตามต่อไปตอนท้ายนี้ก็ต้องขอบคุณนะคะขอบคุณสมาคมบริษัทจดทะเบียนขอบคุณตลาดหลักทรัพย์แห่งประเทศไทยขอบคุณคุณปัลลวีอุยานันท์ผู้ถอดความจากภาษาอังกฤษเป็นภาษาไทยให้กับเรานะคะแล้วก็ขอบคุณท่านผู้ชมนะคะต้องบอกว่า stay safe นะคะขอบคุณค่ะสวัสดีค่ะ